Hey, friends. Hey, before we get started, don't miss my classes at the Fiber Fabric Craft Festival, May 2nd and 3rd at the Donald E. Stephens Convention Center in Rosemont, Illinois. It's just a few miles from Chicago O'Hare Airport. There's a panty party on May 2nd featuring 3 underwear styles and a full kit of essentials to make it easy for you to get started. And there's sewing with stickers. Learn clever adhesive tricks for organizing your sewing and get giveaways from Avery Labels. Spots are limited, so sign up now at fiberfabriccraft.com. Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together. Hey friends, hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And as I say every other week, this is a very special episode because this episode is going to have us thinking about understitching, stay stitching, and the rest of the stitching you feel like skipping. Because sometimes we want a little bit of, that's how we say, shortcuts. You might just want to get it done. That these steps feel, well, I can't speak for anyone else, but for myself, when I was impatient and I did not want to do these things. And I felt like the steps, they slowed me down, or that I could, kind of live without them, and who would notice? It's just my own clothes. I think it's important, at least for my own practice, and this is something I would invite you to consider, that these quiet techniques that make your garments look intentional are things you don't want to skip. I think that there is an important difference between how a garment can look good and how it can look great, or how a garment can look fine or adequate versus excellent. And there's a lot of steps in between that. But one of them, some of the fundamental ones, are stitches that we are going to be talking about today. We'll talk about understitching. We'll talk about stay stitching. We'll talk about basting, and we will talk about hand stitching. In the interest of fairness, I am also talking about hand stitching. All right, to begin, what is understitching? Understitching is stitching the seam allowance to the facing or lining of a garment so that it rolls to the inside. This prevents the facings from flipping out. You do this after you have trimmed/graded your seam allowance. That is understitching. Stay stitching is a single line of stitching inside the seam allowance. It stabilizes curves. You will find it on many necklines, some armholes, and it prevents those things from stretching out. It's important that these things are done early before handling can distort the fabric. That's what stay stitching can help prevent. Basting. Basting are temporary stitches used to hold layers together. It can be done by machine, where you find your stitch length. You select the absolute longest stitch that you have, and you use that for your basting. Another thing I like to do when I'm basting is to use a different color, a really bright color that doesn't match what I'm sewing at all, to make it easier to see, so I can retrieve that basting thread after I'm finished with the piece. Now, sometimes if it's in the seam allowance, it lives there. It lives there forever. Unless for some reason you can see it through but if I'm going to be serging it or French seaming it or whatever, and it can just live there with its new friends. Another way of basting that is important will take us into hand stitching. You can hand baste things. It can be very helpful to do that. So, in terms of hand stitching, here are some things that I also wanted to remind you of. These are things you might have seen in your sewing patterns, in your books, in your tutorials. The first hand stitch that many people learn beyond like learning basic hand stitches like the running stitch or the back stitch is for apparel making, the slip stitch. The slip stitch is is a nearly invisible stitch from the outside, and it's used to close linings, facings, and hems. There comes a time when you are turning your garment inside out through the hole that you have made to be able to turn your garment inside out, and you want to close that. It's not possible to close the entire thing by machine. There will still be a certain degree of space. It could be a hand's width, or it could be even a little bit longer, but being able to stitch that with a slip stitch makes it look really nice. It alternates between a garment and a fold as well. And that's another reason that the slip stitch can be really useful. Slip stitches can also be used to hold down facings. If you would like to do that as well. Like they might say, as you turn your facing or your neckline outside to inside, you've clipped, you've pressed, you've understitched, etc. Now that at the shoulder seam, you'll want that to connect. You can connect it with a slip stitch, or you can use a catch stitch, and that's a flexible cross hand stitch, and it's used for hemming, especially on coats or thicker fabrics. It allows movement while keeping the hem secure, and that's why it also works for facings. I found that you can kind of just stitch, you can flip it from the outside to the inside, and then you can stitch that right to the seam line. I can also say that I have, on occasion, when I did not want to do a catch stitch or a slip stitch or any hand stitching, I would skip it and then I would stitch in the ditch on the outside of the shoulder. Truth be told, I do it still. However, I am willing to accept and admit that that is a teeny tiny bit raggedy. And if I were wanting to submit a garment for competition, which I don't, I would make sure I was hand doing those finishings. I would not just be stitching it in the ditch and moving on with my life. I would be stitching it by hand and complaining to anyone who would listen. Now, let's talk about why these things matter. What are the functional purposes of these stitches? They are not just designed to make you slow down, breathe, listen to an audiobook, and hand stitch things. It is a functional purpose, primarily around the way that these stitches anticipate fabric mobility. For understitching, this controls the fabric behavior on necklines. It will help that neckline to just, especially when you do it well on a nice, cool, like cotton or linen or something that can hold a nice press. Perfection, that understitch. It really is helpful. So there is a reason for it. The stay stitching is crucial. There's a reason why on a lot of the big 5 patterns, you find stay stitching as one of the very first steps in that series of pattern instructions. And it might even say, we won't show the stay stitching for future in future steps of this project, but just know you are meant to stay stitch everywhere we have suggested. And that's because stay stitching prevents distortion before it starts. So that's the function of stay stitching. Because that collar in this context, because that neckline is cut on the bias, when you are cutting a curve on a woven fabric, you will be cutting across the grain of the fabric in such a way that exposes the bias edges. Those bias edges stretch and grow just because they have been cut. And the more you use and handle it, the more you, for example, take off and on your shirt, the more stretched it's going to become. So one way to keep it from stretching out and to give it support and stability is the stay stitching. Basting is useful because it lets you test before committing to a look. I definitely like basting when I have something that's complicated and, I don't want to do it more than once. I will baste it once and look at it and confirm, and then I can move on to the final stitching. Both of these elements, all of these elements actually, the stay stitching and the understitching, they do the job of stabilizing. They do the job of, especially for example, if you think about what stay stitching and understitching and basting can do, one of the things I like about stay stitching, not just around the neckline, but also on the shoulders. I have had these, well, I guess I'll talk about what happens when you don't do these things, but the stabilization with stay stitching really does reinforce the shoulder seams, especially in knits or drapey fabrics. These fabrics can grow, they can look sloppy. You could have a shoulder that might start here toward the middle of your shoulder, and then it drips down to the shoulder cap. Like that's weird. And that is because the fabric itself was not properly stabilized. So preventing the stretching at those high stress points, which are the collar, which are the shoulder, are really important to do. And it also has an impact on looks. When you have a really great understitching, it really does make the garment last longer. It looks better, it feels better, and it gives you those kind of clean edges that stay put. It gives you necklines that don't ripple or gape. It gives you garments that hold their shape over time. I'm excited to share that I'll be teaching at the Fiber and Fabric Craft Festival in Rosemont, Illinois, April 30th through May 3rd, 2026 at the Donald E. Stevens Convention Center, just a few miles from Chicago O'Hare Airport. This new consumer event from the organizers of H&H Americas features hands-on classes, workshops, and an exhibit hall full of creative inspiration, including 220 vendors. I'm teaching Panty Party on Saturday, May 2nd, a 6-hour class where we sew 3 styles of undies, and Sewing with Stickers on Sunday, May 3rd, all about the surprising uses for everyday adhesives and sewing, plus giveaways from Avery Labels. Learn more at fiberfabriccraft.com, and I hope to see you there. Now, here's the dun, 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 dun part of our program. What happens when you skip these steps? I'm sad to say that I can tell you what happens when you skip any one of these steps, because I have skipped all of them. At some point in my many years of sewing, I have absolutely thought, why on earth am I going to make it twice? Why on earth am I going to baste this and then sew it? What? That's ridiculous. I'm not doing that. I don't have all day. I only have so much time to sew in the first place. Let me just go ahead, do it, get it done, out of the way, and see what happens. What happens is tears. What happens is rage. What happens is work that you end up having to redo because you didn't do it right the first time. And by you, I mean me. So when you skip understitching, your facings roll out. It looks so awkward, especially because for the big 5 patterns, they make facings that are so huge, I think they could be kites. Why are the facings so big? You could use bias tape, but all is to say, understitching. Understitching will help your facings look good. It'll help the facings do the job they were meant to do, and that is to make your shoulders and necklines look good. It will also, when you combine understitching with stay stitching, it keeps your necklines from stretching out and from warping. It also helps prevent twisted seams and uneven hems. And I think this is something I struggle through, but it is absolutely the truth. I do spend more time fixing than doing it right the first time. And that can be like a little exhausting and embarrassing. if only I had done it this way. Well, I chose not to. And now that I know better, I do better. And I choose to do almost everything on this list except for hand stitching. Next segment. How do you do these things? How do you do the stitching? What is the basic flow of these things? So I'm going to talk about how to do these things, especially my favorite, understitching. Now, this is the basic workflow of an understitch. You're going to sew your seam. That means you're going to put your neckline and facing together. You then trim and grade those seam allowances. Take those seam allowances and press them toward the facing. You then stitch close to the seam on the facing side. That's why it's understitching. It's not on the top of the garment, it is underneath it. You will catch the seam allowance underneath. So that is the basic function. I want to reinforce something significant. Remember, you have stitched this, trimmed and graded, pressed the seam allowances toward the facing. And when you go to do your close stitch to the seam, there are two ways to do this. One, you can use a straight stitch. The only thing that's going to show up with your understitching is the bobbin side of the thread of the facing. That's something that only you will see. If you want to make sure it's neat and tidy, you can make sure it's in the same color as the main fabric so that it blends in well, but it won't be seen outwardly. This takes me to the second method, which is the 3-step zigzag. A 3-step zigzag is a great friend of understitching. I like the way it moves. A three-step zigzag is actually like a jumbo zigzag made up of 3 stitches. So one leg of the zigzag, let's call it the zig, goes ... And then the other leg of the zigzag, we'll call it zag, goes ... So you get zig, 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 zag, zag, zag. And that makes the 3-step zigzag. It makes great understitching because I like the width of it, the weight. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the 3-step zigzag. Now, stay stitching. This is, again, the basic way to do a stay stitching. This is when you stitch just inside the seam allowance. It is not something your stay stitching will not show on the outside because it will always be just inside the seam allowance. You could do it 1/8 within the seam allowance. You could do it 1/4 within the seam allowance, but you want to make sure that the stabilization you are providing is close to the seam, but not interfering with the seam. So you'll follow the directions of the grain to avoid distortion. When you are encouraged to do stay stitching on a neckline, you will see it say stitch from the middle toward the left and then stitch from the middle toward the right. It is guiding you to stitch in different directions so that you follow the direction of the grain line. And this will avoid distortion. I've already talked earlier about how these curved seams around the neckline are biased. They can stretch easily. It's almost like these little raw nerves of the fabric are exposed and need to be kind of stabilized in order to be well prepared for the next sewing step. Stay stitching is important to do before handling curved edges. Basting, both by machine and by hand, the way you do this is you find your longest stitch length, make it easy to remove. If you're doing hand basting, use long running stitches. This will give you control and precision, but also make it a little bit easier to take out. Now, basting is helpful, I found, when I'm fitting things, when I want to make sure that, is this going to be too tight or too loose? I will baste it and then I might baste it again. And if I'm testing different fits, I will switch out the bobbin thread just to be able to tell the difference between when I did something. So, for example, if I'm trying to make something smaller, I will start with a maybe more conservative estimate and stitch that one line and baste that one line, and then I'll go in a little bit further and baste it again. And if I start doing that like way too much, or if I'm doing quite a bit of it, I will make sure to switch the threads out so that I can tell which one I think works the best once I take the garment off and look at it again. So I'm like, oh, great, I have all this basting on here, but I don't know which one is the one that fits the best. So one way for me to basically keep track of the basting that I've done is to switch out the bobbin thread sometimes, because that's easier than rethreading the machine. Not that threading the machine is hard, but you know what I mean. But basting is also super helpful for setting in sleeves. It's really helpful for Y seams. Y seams is something that you find a little bit more in quilting or in some decorative sewing, where you're sewing like 3E, like trapezoidal squares together. Anyway, and that's just a way for almost like Cubert, when you had these squares one on top of the other. And that's what a Y seam is. And it's a little tricky to do solely on machine. So hand stitching is kind of one of the few ways to do it, unless you have a pattern design just for that. Hand finishing techniques are also really important. The catch stitch is a great thing for hems that need flexibility, like on coats and skirts. And if you are sewing on something really thick and heavy, it might be difficult to get 4 or 5 layer of coat fabric through your sewing machine. Even if you have an industrial one, you might just want the coat hem to look a little more seamless. And one thing about a machine stitched hem is that it looks like a machine stitched hem. Slip stitches also provide invisible finishing on facings and linings. Now, once I started doing these steps rather than skipping them, my sewing radically improved. It just did. It just looked better almost immediately. The edges lay flat, the facing stayed inside, the garment looked sharper and more professional. I was less frustrated during the sewing process, even with hand sewing. Basting in a set-in sleeve, especially on a delicate fabric before machine stitching it, gives me better control. It lets me look and see that things are all smooth as they need to be. Like, it really does make a big difference. A catch stitch hemming for coats, as I said before, durability and flexibility, giving this really beautiful and clean finish for the inside of the garment, which again, no one's going to see but you will see it. And don't you deserve the best? I think so. So to wrap up, I want to talk about that knowing the why might help you decide when to skip these steps or not skip these steps. These steps, they're not about perfection. They're about taking or claiming a certain degree of interest in your sewing practice. It will help you get better results if better results are something that you want. These are small steps that create big results. And they are things that you can easily skip if you want to. But if you don't want to, this episode has tried to explain how to do them, why they matter. And at the end of the day, it's not that hard. It just takes a little bit more time. And that is the thing I believe you and your sewing are worth. So let's see. In terms of the slogan of the Stitch Please podcast is that we will help you get your stitch together. And I think this episode helps us get our stitch together by reminding us that you can elevate your sewing by respecting the invisible work of these techniques. They support your sewing, they support your fabric, they support how things fit, and they support your final finish. The difference shows, even when the stitches don't. Let me know what you're skipping or not skipping. I told you the things that I was skipping. I totally used to skip stay stitching. I totally used to skip understitching. And now I love understitching. So people can grow, skills can develop. How has that meant for you? Is there anything that you skip that you don't want to skip anymore, or things that you used to skip but don't? Or if you're like, I am going to be a habitual skipper, let me know what you will keep skipping and why. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.